So good afternoon and welcome back to Craigmillar Castle. We said in our live broadcast that we would bring you into the castle because the walls are so thick here that we can't pick up a signal. But hopefully with this recording, you'll be able to see the inside and the outside. Now, I love Craigmillar Castle. It's only about 4 miles to the southeast of Edinburgh. The original park goes back to the 14th century. It is full of history. If these walls could talk, the stories they could tell, and we're going to try and give you some of the stories. Again, it's got royal connections, it's got plots, it's got gunpowder, it's got royal connections, and it's connected both internationally and nationally. Now I just want to have a look around here in the south. This is the southeastern tower here. The two families that it's connected with here are the Prestons, that Mike is going to talk more about the Prestons, and the Gilmores. Now the Gilmores still have a very, very close relationship with this structure here, with the castle. In fact, just to my right over here, we have the remains of a little chapel here. And this is where, even to this day, the Gilmores use as their burial chamber here. So if you look inside the graves here, you'll see graves going right up to the early 2000s, 2007, 2008. And it's a lovely, lovely little structure. This place is also very romantic. It's associated with the Mary Queen of Scots. We're going to talk about Mary in a little bit more detail. So get your pens ready, get your notepads out, and we'll give you the story of the tragic and romantic life of Mary Queen of Scots. Now just over to my left here, over the hill just outside the grounds of the castle, is an area still to this day known as Little France. And it's called Little France because this is where Mary, when she came back from France with her retinue, her French retinue, established themselves in the area called Little France. But we'll talk more about that as we walk around. Let's have a little walk around. Now one of the things we also have here in the southeast range of the castle is the well for the castle itself. So here we've got the water of life. You couldn't live in your castle without your well. All the castles had to be supplied. If you were under siege for any reason, you want to make sure you've got your fresh water. Now Craigmillar Castle had ample grounds, so they would grow their own produce. They also had their own fish ponds, which Mike will talk about later. So they had access to good food and fresh water, which is all that you need. They also have a very, very nice wine cellar. So all your food groups are taken care of here in this castle. So it started in the 14th century with additions in the 15th right through to the 16th. We're going to take a walk through into the main courtyard. Now when people do think of Edinburgh, they always think of Edinburgh Castle, but I would highly recommend that if you actually come to Edinburgh, which we hope you will next year, you put Craigmillar Castle on your itinerary. It's still used today. In fact, you can actually rent the castle if you want to. If you want to have a marriage here, you can get married here, you can have a wedding reception. So it still is actively used. Most of it is in the ruin though, but we'll take you into some of those great rooms inside the castle itself. Let's walk through the little arch and come into the north-facing side of the castle itself. So it is a bit of a fortress. When you come to the side, you get an idea of scale. And above the gateways and doorways, you'll see lovely plaques dedicated to the families that lived here. And you'll also see there's some defensive windows here in the towers as well. These structures were built to last. As I said, some of the walls here are 9 feet thick, so approximately 3 meters thick. Mary Queen of Scots. Tragic and romantic. Probably one of the better known queens, not only of Scotland, but I think also of Great Britain. She was the cousin to Elizabeth. When Mary was born, her father died only a few days after she was born. So she became queen when she was still in swaddling. Her father died just a little bit further north from here. And it's thought that he died either of dysentery from poisoned water or dirty water, And also people say that it may be because he was depressed because his army had lost a major battle against the English in the Battle of Solway Moss. Whatever happened, Mary was made queen when she was only a baby. And it is said that on his deathbed, that her father, James V, has said the dynasty came with the glass and would leave with the lass. Meaning that the whole of the Stuart dynasty came through the daughter, Marjorie, of Robert the Bruce, who married into the Stuarts. Now he thought it would end with Mary, but the Stuart dynasty continued well after Mary. But it did end with the lass. It ended with Queen Anne, who was the last Stuart monarch of Great Britain. Let's move in a little bit further, go into this wonderful courtyard here. I'm very impressed by these old yew trees that are here. Now it's said that these yew trees also have a close association. They may have been actually planted at the time when Mary was here. So they're hundreds of years old. Of course, yew trees are highly poisonous, so I'm not going to go near them. But you find them in cemeteries and churchyards here in Great Britain. They're also known as the tree of life or the everlasting tree because when the branches drop, they can root, and so they have perpetual growth on them. They're even mentioned by Shakespeare in Macbeth, when Macbeth makes this concoction with the berries. I don't know if I can get a good view of the berries here, but there's some nice, beautiful red berries here on the tree. Very poisonous. So Mary became queen. Her mother was Marie de Guise. Marie de Guise was French. She was the second wife of James V. And Henry VIII was on the throne down in England. Now Henry had thought it would be a great idea that if the young Mary would be betrothed to his son Edward and could unite the throne. Now Mary was a very, very valuable commodity because she had both Tudor blood and Stuart blood. So she had very, very valuable genes, both dynasties, very royal, running through it. Blue blood from both sides. And if Henry thought it would be a good idea if the crowns were united. However, the nobles in Scotland thought it's not a good idea because Henry had already gone through this Reformation down in England, where he broke away from Rome. Scotland was still in a Catholic country and still influenced by Rome. So they didn't want a Catholic country uniting with the Protestant country. This, of course, upset Henry a great deal. Henry decided then to do what Henry does, stomped his feet a lot, and then he decided to invade Scotland. And it was known as the War of the Rough Wooing. So Mary was about 2 years old at this time. Henry's troops came over, laid waste to the borderlands here in Scotland, got right into Edinburgh, did a lot of destruction in Holyrood Palace itself. Mary was then spirited across the country to keep in hiding, and it was eventually decided that young Mary would be sent over to France to live with the de Guise family. So her mother became Queen Regent here for quite a while. And Mary was brought up in the French court, speaking French. She learned Latin. She did deportment. She could read, write, play music. She became a very, very cultured young lady. And again, a very highly valued commodity in terms of the marriage stakes. So much so that when Mary was growing up, she was growing up with a young prince in France, Francois. And when they were of age, Mary and Francois married. So Mary became not only the Queen of Scotland, she was now the Queen of France too. And remember, she always thought that she had a call on the throne in England. Because by the time that she was married, England had gone through a few changes. Henry's son had died. His first daughter, Mary, Bloody Mary, had also died. And it was Elizabeth I who was on the throne in England. Elizabeth I and Mary were cousins. But Elizabeth I was always known as the bastard queen because she was the daughter of Anne Boleyn. And we all know what happened to Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn got her head chopped off as well. So Mary always thought that she had a great claim on the English throne. So not only was she Queen of France, Queen of Scotland, she wanted to go for the hat trick, as we say here in the UK, and go for the Queen of England as well, get the English throne. So the marriage of Mary and Francois lasted for about a year. Francois then died through an ear infection. Again, in those days, there was no antibiotics, so yep, you could easily die of any minor infections, so he died. Now, unfortunately for Mary, his mother was Catherine de' Medici, and the Medicis were probably the most feared and fearsome family in the whole of Europe. They were ruthless, and Catherine Medici made sure that all the accoutrements of state went from her first son Francois to her second son. So Mary was left without a country in France. They did look around for another prince to marry her. So they looked at the Portuguese, looked at the Spanish, but nobody seemed suitable. So Mary ended up coming back to Scotland. And this is where the trouble began, because she was coming back to her country, which over the past 10, 15 years had gone through its own turmoil. The Reformation was in full flow, and Scotland was becoming a Protestant country. So she left France, where she wasn't wanted, came back to Scotland, and she wasn't wanted in Scotland. But let's go inside the building now, and we'll have a little look inside the building, and we'll continue our story of Mary. Now, we're having to follow a one-way system here. There's COVID restrictions, so we've got the castle more or less to ourselves at the moment, which is great, but we will follow the rules, and we'll go into some of the rooms in here so you can have a look inside and see what life was like when people were living here in the 14th, 15th century. So we're going to make our way up to the Great Tower, and we're going to the Lairds Hall. But just to give you an idea of the thickness of the walls, I'm sure you're picking this up in the camera. Now, though it all looks gloomy and dark in here at the moment, there would have been windows in here. A lot of the windows have been blocked up. And there would have been lots of colour, there would have been lots of light in here, there would be torches, there would be tapestries. This would be like a small town, because not only have the families living here, you had all the support staff who'd be working here as well. Think of the royal family down south. When they go on an entourage, they bring all the people with them. So think of all the staff that are there to support these grand families, noble families of Scotland. Let's take a little bit walk upstairs and we can take you into the Lairds Hall. Now, it is uneven on the floors. And we'll go up the circular staircase. So this is the Lairds Hall. You can still rent this hall out. You can have dinners here. You can bring your caterers in. Have a look at the vaulted ceiling here. But the ceiling didn't go all the way up, because if Mike can maybe pick up, sticking out from the walls here, we've got these corbels. And these would support the beams. So this would be the roof at this roof height. Now in here, they would have huge fires burning. They'd have tapestries, colourful tapestries hanging from the wall. There'd be music being played. Just think of the atmosphere at a regular wedding when they had the grand feasts here. And also, you've got lovely little window seats here, so you can sit and while away your day whilst looking out to the north across the river, or down south to the hills. And one of the grandest places that I love, and I'm going to stand in it so you can get an idea of perspective. Great views down to the city of Edinburgh. So even from here, you can see what's happening down in Edinburgh. I'm going to stand here, and there's a wonderful fireplace. give you an idea of the perspective. And they'd have the little boys that here tending all the fires, keeping the fires going. And it is open to the elements, so maybe Mike can come in and have a look up the chimney. Right up, and you can see right through the sky. It's great echoes in here as well, great acoustics. So back to Mary. Mary came back to Scotland. As I mentioned, the country had become Protestant. She came back here as queen, and she was allowed to practice her Catholic rituals when she came back. She came back with her French entourage or retinue. She came back here. But life wasn't too kind for her. She played a good game to begin with, and to all intents and purposes, she was accepted as long as she kept her rituals to a minimum. But then the hunt was on to find a new husband for Mary. So they were looking around, and her cousin, Lord Darnley, came into the fore. Now, she had met Lord Darnley before. Lord Darnley came from Scottish parents, but he was born in England. Now, he really should have asked, because he was a lord, he needed to ask permission from Elizabeth I to marry Mary, but he didn't. So that caused a little bit of a rift between Mary and Elizabeth. Again, it could have been a great marriage because you've got this young Englishman marrying into the Scottish throne. Now, Darnley came from a royal family. He also had a claim on the throne there. So it looked like it could have been a good match. And indeed, it was thought. He was very handsome, and it looked like it was going to be a love match between Mary and Darnley. However, Darnley was vain, arrogant, a bit of a waster. He was very aggressive towards Mary. He always wanted to be made king. And it was Mary's gift to make him king. But king is above queen. And Mary wasn't going to have that. Because then, when you play a game of cards, king always trumps queen. So he was jealous of the title that he wasn't going to get. He always wanted to be made king. And this again caused the rift. He was also very jealous of the people that were around Mary. He was particularly jealous of her secretary, Rizzio. He was Italian. He was fluent in many languages, and he would scribe for Mary. And Mary fell pregnant. So something must have happened between them. It was great. But during the pregnancy, Darnley was getting more and more and more jealous of the situation, because he knew in his own head that if she was to have a son, then Darnley would be further down in the pecking order in terms of being able to get the throne. And one evening, when Mary was in Holyrood House, in the palace down in Holyrood, she was there with her ladies in waiting and Rizzio, and they were having after dinner discussions, sitting around. Darnley burst into the private rooms of Queen Mary while they were all sitting there with his henchmen. She was only a couple of weeks away from giving birth. Whether or not the intention was for her to lose the baby, we don't know. But certainly they murdered her secretary Rizzio in front of her. That's no way to impress a lady, is by murdering the secretary by any means. So Darnley kind of went on the run for a while, but he fell ill. Nowadays they actually think he had syphilis, so he was having a syphilitic attack. He was encouraged to come back to Edinburgh. In the meantime, when he was encouraged to come back, Mary had had a baby. She had given birth to King James. She herself wasn't very well, and Mary ended up coming back to Craigmillar Castle and to recuperate for a while, and just to get away from the hurly-burly of Edinburgh. And also she didn't really want her diseased husband to be anywhere near the baby as well. But while she was here in this hall, the other nobles were here as well. And there was a plot devised here. And the plot was the nobles that supported Mary were going to get rid of Darnley. So Darnley was encouraged to come back to Edinburgh. The best physicians were here in Edinburgh. And instead of taking residence here in the castle, which he was encouraged to, because he didn't like the Preston family at all, he didn't get on with the Prestons very well, he stayed in another house just near the palace in an area known as the Kirk o' Fields. It was near the Blackfriars Monastery. Then, one evening, Mary went to visit him in his house while he was recuperating, and she was returning back to the palace because there was a wedding feast going on in the palace. As she was going back to the palace, there was this huge explosion. And you know what it's like in those days when you had the odd barrel of gunpowder lying around the kitchen. Well, the whole place blew up. Now, they all rushed to find out what happened, and assuming that Darnley was also blown up in this explosion, they went there, but they found Darnley's body in the garden. He had been strangled. So it looks like he'd either been tipped off that this attack was going to happen, or he heard people in the house and decided to make his escape. So he escaped with him and his equerry, got out of the house, were captured in the garden, and they were strangled. But Mary was implicated in the death or the murder of Lord Darnley. And this is where things really came to a boil here in Scotland. Let's move on. We'll go upstairs and have a look upstairs as well. So it is suggested that this is a room where Mary came to recuperate when she was feeling ill herself. It's an old kitchen that had been converted into a chamber, a lady's chamber. It also has an old sluice gate here, which could be used as a toilet. Remember, no flush toilets in those days. But you'd have excellent views, and it's south facing, so she would get the sun coming in. Not big windows, but sun would certainly come in through the south and the southeast. And there's a little privy chamber, which is open to the elements, but give a lady some privacy. So the plot that was concocted here in Craigmillar Castle was led by one of her nobles, especially Lord Bothwell. Bothwell also had his own intentions with regards to Mary. He was ambitious, greedy, to say the least. But the murder of Lord Darnley was certainly the turning point. And she could never, ever, ever shake off the suspicion that she was involved in the plot. And the plot was known as the Craigmillar Bond. The nobles decided to put an end to Lord Darnley. Now, Mary herself moved from Craigmillar and she went up to Stirling. It was on the way to Stirling, on the way back from Stirling, that she was intercepted by Bothwell, Lord Bothwell, who was on her side. But Lord Bothwell and his troops intercepted Mary. And it's thought that, and various writers have said this in the past, that she was abducted and actually raped by Bothwell. And Bothwell had just divorced his first wife about 10 days before this event happened, and it said that he raped Mary, and to preserve her virtue, as it were, they actually ended up getting married in a Protestant service rather than a Catholic service. It was quite interesting because Mary was an ardent Catholic. But that caused civil war to break out. This is when the nobles erupted. Mary had a half-brother. He was the bastard son of James V. And he rallied the troops against us. So it became a family situation. A half-brother who was brought up as a Protestant rallied the troops. Mary was then captured, taken into captivity, forced to abdicate to her young son. So again, we have another baby becoming a monarch while still in their diapers or their nappies. Mary was then taken to a lake up north on an island which had a tower, and she was held up in Loch Leven on a tower in Scotland before she even got into trouble down in England. Let's move further upstairs and we'll get you some of the views from the roof of the castle here. There are some spectacular views up here from the roof of the castle. And you're looking over some views that would have been more or less the same when Mary Queen of Scots was here, because we've got Arthur's Seat here, which is the extinct volcano, which is a great place in Edinburgh. People love Arthur's Seat, the old extinct volcano. And you've got the crags, you can just see the cliffs of the crags there. In fact, the word Craig in Scots means rock. So this is Craigmillar Castle, so it's a rock of Miller. So Craig, crag. If you ever get the name Craig, you know it means a rock in Scottish. And you get a beautiful view right across down to the river. So you can see any ships that would be approaching at all, indeed. So Mary was held captive in Loch Leven in a castle on an island. They didn't think she was going to be able to escape, but she did. She managed to make an escape there. She is supposed to have wooed, because she's supposed to be a very beautiful woman, but she used her charms on the sons of her captors up in Loch Leven. She managed to get a boat, and she got a boat. She was able to go from the island back to the mainland again. When she got here, back to the mainland, she was able to rally her troops, and her troops, she still had a lot of loyal supporters, and her troops massed over to in the west of Scotland, and this is where Mary met her final defeat against her half-brother. And then Mary was forced to escape across the river, the Solway, over to England. And as they say, you cannot have two bees in the same, you can have two queens in the same beehive. So the last thing that Elizabeth wanted was this Scottish queen who had a great call on her throne coming over to England. So Mary was out of the frying pan into the fire. Mary was captured while she was in England, and then eventually was taken to Fotheringay Castle, which is near Peterborough. And she was implicated in many, many plots to dislodge Elizabeth and the Protestant throne from the Protestant throne so that Mary could take over. So all these Catholic conspiracies were heard about all the time. They were terrified of Mary and what she could do, so they wanted to suppress Catholicism in England. Finally, she was engaged or implicated in a plot called the Babington Plot. It's actually said that the papers for signing the execution were hidden down in a load of papers that Elizabeth was supposed to sign. So they would say whether or not it's true or not that Elizabeth inadvertently signed the execution order. But Mary met her fate. After about 18 years imprisonment in England, she was executed by having her head chopped off. Her body was initially interred in Peterborough Cathedral, but then when her son, James VI of Scotland, did finally take the throne in England when Elizabeth I died. So I always have this image of Mary standing with her head in her arms here, giving her the last laugh. You know, Mary has the last laugh because her son fulfilled her own dreams of the Scots and the Stuarts taking over the monarchy in England. And that monarchy would last for another 100 years or so. The last queen of the Stuart dynasty was Queen Anne, and I mentioned Olivia Colman. I'm sure you've been watching, some of you are watching The Royals, but she was also in another movie called The Favourite, and it was all about Queen Anne. If you haven't seen The Favourite, have a look at it. It's a really funny movie. Olivia Colman's really good in it as well. But Queen Anne was the last of the Stuart dynasties, and it was actually through Queen Anne that the United Kingdom was finally formed, when the governments of Scotland and England united. So rather than being separate kingdoms, we became the United Kingdom in the 1700s, almost 100 years after James VI became King of England and Scotland. So there we have the story of Mary Queen of Scots. We've got Craigmillar Castle, close association. It's full of gunpowder plots, it's full of intrigue, it's full of the romance, it's got the French influence here, it's got the whole Mary story all in one. So I'm going to hand over to Mike, and Mike is going to continue the tour. But I hope you're getting a good idea of what it's like inside here, and I hope you're enjoying it. Speak to you later.
Hello and welcome to our tour of Craigmillar Castle. Joe has just completed the first part and showed you a bit of the interiors of the Tower House and the East Range. We're still in the East Range at the moment. So thank you for joining Joe and Mike's Virtual Tours of Scotland, and we're covering some of the more outlying areas of Edinburgh. This is a very important castle which dates back to the late 14th century, would you believe? But we're in the kind of 16th century area, which was an addition to the main central Tower House, which was the older occupied area. But then as time went on, people wanted to have a bit more luxury in their lives and started extending the castle. So I can show you in this illustration here, this plan. This is the older part, which is called the Tower House or Keep. A very typical castle arrangement in the centre, surrounded by a courtyard. And we are in this part here, and this is called the gallery where we are at. And this would be an area to display pictures, to play music, to generally enjoy life with nice views and keeping warm as well. So this was extended by the Preston family in the 16th century into this area here and further over to the east also. Some of the older parts of the castle are over on this other part in the West Range, and I'm going to talk about that with you later. So we can walk further over here towards the north with Edinburgh in the distance. Well, we're in Edinburgh. The thing about Craigmillar Castle, it was described as being off Edinburgh, but not in Edinburgh. So it was very convenient because the occupants of here had powerful connections to the royal family, to the kings and queens of Scotland, but they weren't close enough to the city to have to take the flak, if you like, with various decisions which may have been unpopular and even alliances and such like. So this was quite a convenient place for plotting and making plots. And Joe mentioned with regard to Mary Queen of Scots' husband, the Craigmillar Bond, which was formed here for the assassination of her husband, who was King Henry Darnley. You can just imagine it was just far enough out of Edinburgh, but then not too far away, so within convenient travelling distance. In the more recent times of the 19th century, surprisingly enough, it was thought to be a residence, a possible residence for Queen Victoria, because it was very romantic. She was very much an artist who loved the romance of old castles and would have probably loved it here. But then they decided, no, for some reason that didn't happen. So Joe's just going to show you some of the openings in the doors, and you can see on the left hand side a fireplace, because this would have been a story above, a floor above. And just with wear and tear, and this being such an ancient building, the inside floors have collapsed or been destroyed over time. This castle did suffer a siege also during the rough wooing, when the soldiers of Henry VIII ambushed the castle, and it was all to do with not being able to have arrange a marriage with the young Mary Queen of Scots and his son, who was Prince Edward. It's never going to happen, but he wasn't too happy with that. But then, well, Simon Preston was the occupant of the castle, the owner, and he didn't really bother defending it. He knew it was going to be a hopeless task, and he surrendered, and he was in prison for a while. But having surrendered the castle, he was let off. Didn't lose his life, but the castle had suffered quite a lot and had been burnt in the process back then. And we're going over to the West Range. Now, once again, I'm going to show you the little map here, and the West Range is here, this covered area here. It was originally an outer banqueting hall for entertaining more guests than you could actually receive in the Lairds Hall, where Joe took you before. That could only accommodate a maximum of 70 people, but these people are so powerful, they were actually barons, meaning they had feudal rights and power over the surrounding area, so they're very wealthy and powerful. So this was an original banqueting hall which was attached to the 15th century Tower House here with an access, but then it was changed of use in, it was actually in 1660 where another family took over called the Gilmore family. And John Gilmore, he was a confidant of King Charles II. He was also president of the Court of Session, as high as you could get in the law in Scotland, so immensely powerful. So Joe is just showing you the Gilmore coat of arms at the moment. And very significant there, if you look to the left-hand side of that shield, you will see 3 quills, and that very much connects with Sir John Gilmore and his legal practice. This coat of arms was put there, would you believe, in the mid-20th century by one of the descendants of the family. The Gilmores left the castle in the 18th century. It was sort of given up. It became a ruin, and they moved to what was called Inch House, which isn't very far away from here. But you can see the elegant doorway with the pediment above it there. Now, originally, going back to the 15th century, things were a bit more confined, a bit more geared for protection and defence, but in the 17th century they thought they'd got it sussed, and residences tended to be more comfortable and more private and a bit more sophisticated and similar to the way we live today. This was the kitchen area originally in the 17th century, and if you look over to this wall here, you'll see this enormous fireplace, just absolutely massive. And of course that would be for cooking huge roasts and huge joints and so on. You can just imagine them being turned in a huge spit here. And once again, if you look up on the walls, you see these corbels. These are these stone platforms just sticking out of the walls there, and these would be to support an inner floor, another floor above here, a timber floor, which is, of course has deteriorated over time. And we'll walk through into the next space. This space was used by the Gilmore family, of course, in the 17th century as a comfortable drawing room or dining room. And looking at this wall here, the arch shows you where one of the 2 windows used to be, because beyond this wall was a most beautiful, elegant, formal garden with raised box beds and sundials and sculptures and seating areas and ponds and some of the most elegant decorative garden features. And they could look out the window and enjoy all that from huge windows, which are no longer windows, they're blocked up. And this fireplace. This is a 17th century fireplace, and notice the raised up bits just above the what we call the lintel of the fireplace, and these would have been painted with the Gilmore's coats of arms originally. And you had to keep yourself warm, but being wealthy, they were able to invest in elegant Persian rugs, and not to be walked on, to be hung on the walls to keep the cold out. And of course, enormous fires. So that's why you would have these huge fireplaces here as well. Looking over again, just through the door and up, you can see a different level of accommodation above too. And there would have been other rooms, bedrooms with drawing rooms, galleries and such like, similar to the East Range where we were at the beginning of my section of the tour today. So we'll move further on. This here they say, if we're looking back at the 15th century, before the Gilmores came here and changed it around, would have been a raised chamber where you would have had the banqueting hall beyond this, and this would have been a more private area with a dais, a raised area. And we have got a 16th century fireplace. This dates back to 1500. So this would have been here when Mary Queen of Scots was here. Just totally amazing to think of that. And of course you can see the work and effort that went into this sculpture work, whereas the other later fireplace is a bit plainer. So you've got all this elegant pillar work and carving, a labour of love, the craftspeople who would be working on this sort of thing. So this was a withdrawing chamber. Traditionally, if the hosts got a bit fed up with their guests or they were getting a bit tired, they would withdraw to a more private area, and that's what this was, but it was also used as a bedroom too. And you can see a window that isn't blocked up, once again, would have given a wonderful view, panoramic view, into the landscape and gardens beyond. This little doorway goes down to the wine cellar, which is kind of you're not able to access it at the moment. The Gilmore family then, the lands of Craigmillar were gifted by King David I to the monks of Dunfermline Abbey, and it was created a barony, meaning people who were close to the king would look after the lands. They would be governing, minor governors if you like, but had the ear of the king, and they were given the privilege of being given this land to develop their house, their fortified tower house. The first one was Simon Preston, and the name Preston comes from Preston Pans, which is along in East Lothian, and the family had estates there. And Preston, the origin of it means priest's town, priest town. So the Preston, Simon Preston, in 1374, started to draw up plans for this amazing residence, and it developed through his family after that. And after him came his great-great-grandson, who was Sir William Preston, maybe more known for his connections with St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, because he travelled France and brought back a reliquary of St Giles, who is the patron saint of Edinburgh. He brought it back to St Giles Cathedral, and there is an aisle in the cathedral called the Preston Aisle to this day, and he is interred there. And he was a great-great-grandson of the first Simon Preston, who was developing the castle here. So we'll move further on. There's various happenings, some unsavoury happenings. We had Simon Preston III, who had connections, great connections with King James III, who didn't get on very well with his family, particularly his younger brothers. And James III got Simon to capture his brother, who was John Stuart, who was Earl of Mar. And he accused him, would you believe, of witchery, because he was just not a convenient brother to have, and had Simon capture him, hold him prisoner here at Craigmillar Castle. And then after a while, he was taken back to Edinburgh with John Stuart. And while he was having a bath one night, James and Simon organised his assassination. And his throat was cut while he was having a bath, and that was the end of John Stuart. So not happy days for the family of King James III, but later on, at the Battle of Sochiburn, it was said that James III's son, who was to become James IV, killed his father. So talk about dysfunctional. You couldn't get much more dysfunctional than that. So there's another connection with Craigmillar Castle. If we take a look over there, at that little tower. That is a ducat in Scots, or dovecot, but we say ducat, and it was for pigeons because it was the case back then in the 16th century that was our main food, how you would keep yourself going, particularly in cold weather when hunting was difficult. And that is unusual, that ducat, because it is got gun loops in it, so it doubled as an extra defence for the castle. Taking us past the main defensive wall, or curtain wall here, and this was put here in the 15th century by Sir William Preston, who I mentioned earlier. Now, Mary Queen of Scots' father, James V, as a young man, spent some time here as well, because there was a plague in Edinburgh in 1517, which was called the pest. And I think what we're experiencing just now is it would be equally called the pest. And he spent time here to be safe, away from the overcrowded city of Edinburgh. It was in the country and not so populated. So James V was here as well. And if we look above the door, we have got an unusual heraldic shield. The three unicorn heads that you see within the shield shape were the Preston family arms. And below that is what we call a rebus, R-E-B-U-S, which is a picture puzzle, which wasn't uncommon in heraldic sculpture work. But on the left-hand side here, you can see a press, as like a printing press for pressing decorative or literary features on cloth or on paper. And on the right is a cask or tun, as it was called in Scots, for holding wine. So on the left hand side we've got the press, and on the right hand side we've got the tun. So we've got Preston very cleverly, and a rebus. Many people will think of Rebus, Inspector Rebus, the character in Ian Rankin's crime novels, and it could be that he borrowed that idea from the picture puzzle, doing a bit of detective work. And just above the dates on that are, I think it's got something like 1510 or something like that. So it's a very ancient heraldic shield as the entrance here into the garden. Behind the trees is Arthur's Seat, which we were looking at from the battlements higher up in the castle. And there was a little access through that gateway there, and that gate is called a yett, Y-E-T-T, because it's a defensive gate which is made from iron and is slatted so that you didn't need to open it. You could see who was there, so it was like a good defensive feature of any castle. And if you went through the gate, we're not actually going to go through there, you would come into the remains of a Presbyterian church, because Preston family were Catholics, but we have what was called the Reformation, 1560, when Scotland's religion changed to be Presbyterian, and the parish church for the parish of Liberton existed just beyond that gateway through here. The castle toilets are in there. The public toilets are in that bit today, so no longer used as a church. So we'll go through this yett. Now we're in what was the pleasure gardens, and if we have a look at the wall on the left hand side, you can see the shapes of blocked up windows, but you can also see gun loops through the tower there. Gunpowder came into being in the 15th century, so this castle was built to withstand heavy bombardment. So it's very thick walls. These walls are, would you believe, 3 meters thick. So not surprising when we did an internal live stream video that we didn't get a signal. So this is why we're doing a recorded one this time. It looks a bit like Camelot. I love it. It's a romantic ruin. Just look at that tower. Just think of Lancelot and King Arthur. It's been used as a movie location, if you're familiar with Outlander, Ardsmuir Prison. It was used as when Jamie was taken prisoner after Culloden, and he met up with Murtagh, who was prisoner at Ardsmuir, and Lord John Grey, who's one of the lead characters in Outlander. They filmed the prison sequences here at Craigmillar Castle. It's also been used in a BBC television series of Ivanhoe, dramatised version in the 1990s, used for that also, and more recently for the Robert the Bruce movie called The Outlaw King. So it's a very favourite location for movie makers. We'll take us over to the pleasure gardens, what used to be. Just beyond these trees is where the quarry for obtaining the stone for building Craigmillar Castle came from. And looking at the uneven groundwork, I can show you this illustration once more, which explains where there was a fish pond, and you can see this shape and the shape of the letter P, and just over the fence there, it is there today. That shape is still recognisable today. It was popular for outdoor activities such as hawking, with birds, of course, falcons and so on, as well as archery and all sorts of recreational activities with the families, going back to the 16th century when the Prestons were here, but also the Gilmores too later. So, Craigmillar Castle, it's brilliant. If you've not been here, highly recommend it. And even better, highly recommend hiring a guide to take you around. And Joe and myself, being local Edinburgh guides, delighted to take you here when things ease up a bit. But having another last look at it, the stonework is just amazing, and look at the bottom how the rock formation is blended into the construction too, and just absolutely amazing. Finally, I'll leave you with this. It was gifted, of course, the rights to have a castle here was gifted to the family, to the Preston family, the rights of barony in 1511 by King James IV, and the terms were that every year at Whitsun a Scottish penny should be paid to the king or queen. And today that law is still in force, but I don't know, and I have my doubts whether that tradition is still existing, but a Scots penny payable at Whitsun, that was the agreement made in order that you could have this castle here.